Tibet, the land of snow-capped mountains, ancient monasteries, and a spiritual culture rooted in Buddhism, has long been a subject of fascination for the world. Yet behind its serene image lies one of the most enduring political struggles of modern times, the struggle of the Tibetan people for freedom and independence. The story of Tibet's struggle is not merely a tale of politics and diplomacy. It is the story of a people fighting to preserve their culture, identity, and very existence against the backdrop of one of the world's most powerful nations, China. To understand the Tibetan struggle for independence, one must begin with the history of Tibet itself. For centuries, Tibet was a unique and self-sufficient civilization, shaped by Buddhism and governed by a system that combined religion and politics. The Tibetan plateau, geographically isolated by the towering Himalayas, remained shielded from outside invasions for much of its history. This isolation allowed Tibet to develop a distinct cultural identity that was different from China and India, its two powerful neighbors. The question of Tibet's political status has always been at the heart of the conflict. For centuries, Tibet maintained a complicated relationship with China. At times, Tibetan rulers acknowledged Chinese emperors in ceremonial ways, while at other times they ruled with full autonomy. In the 13th century, Tibet came under the influence of the Mongol Empire, which later ruled China under the Yuan dynasty. This connection created the foundation of China's claim over Tibet, though Tibet remained largely self-governed. When the Ming dynasty rose in the 14th century, Tibet enjoyed even more independence, as the Ming rulers exercised little control over the region. It was during the Qing dynasty in the 17th century that China began to exert more direct influence over Tibet. The Qing emperors stationed representatives in Lhasa and tried to supervise Tibetan affairs, but Tibet still enjoyed a high degree of autonomy. In practice, Tibet functioned as an independent kingdom with its own government, currency, language, and religious system. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual and temporal leader of Tibet, held authority, and the Tibetan people recognized him as both a political and spiritual guide. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 provided Tibet with a unique opportunity. When the Chinese Empire collapsed, Tibet expelled the remaining Chinese officials and troops from its territory. In 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama declared Tibet's independence, and for the next few decades, Tibet functioned as a de facto independent state. Tibet conducted its own foreign relations, maintained its own army, and governed itself without interference from China. However, the international community never formally recognized Tibet as a sovereign nation, a fact that would later haunt the Tibetan struggle for independence. The early 20th century was a time of great change in Asia. China, weakened by internal strife and foreign invasions, sought to reassert its territorial claims. For Chinese leaders, Tibet was not only a matter of historical pride, but also of strategic importance. Control over Tibet meant control over the vast Himalayan plateau, which served as a buffer zone between China and India. Moreover, Tibet's natural resources and its role as the source of major rivers made it geopolitically significant. The defining moment in Tibet's modern history came in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, came to power in China. The new communist government was determined to consolidate its control over all territories it claimed as part of China, including Tibet. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, marched into eastern Tibet. The Tibetan army, ill-equipped and poorly trained, was no match for the Chinese forces. Within months, China had established military control over much of Tibet. Faced with overwhelming pressure, the Tibetan government was forced to sign the 17-point agreement in 1951. This agreement, signed under duress, promised to preserve Tibet's autonomy, religious freedom, and the authority of the Dalai Lama, while recognizing Chinese sovereignty. In reality, however, the agreement marked the beginning of China's systematic efforts to integrate Tibet into the Chinese state. The Tibetan people saw the agreement not as a treaty of mutual respect, but as an act of coercion. During the 1950s, tensions in Tibet grew. While the Chinese government claimed it was bringing modernization and development to Tibet, the Tibetan people experienced increasing interference in their traditional way of life. Land reforms were imposed, monasteries were placed under surveillance, and Tibetan culture began to face suppression. Resistance movements began to emerge, particularly in eastern Tibet, where guerrilla fighters carried out attacks against Chinese forces. The situation reached a breaking point in 1959. On March 10th of that year, thousands of Tibetans gathered in Lhasa to protest Chinese rule and to protect the Dalai Lama, who they feared was in danger of being kidnapped by Chinese authorities. The protests escalated into a full-scale uprising known as the 1959 Tibetan Uprising. Chinese troops responded with brutal force, shelling Lhasa and crushing the resistance. Tens of thousands of Tibetans were killed and countless others were imprisoned. Amid the chaos, the Dalai Lama was forced to flee Tibet. Disguised as a soldier, he made a perilous journey across the Himalayas and eventually found refuge in India. His escape marked the beginning of the Tibetan government in exile, headquartered in Dharamshala, India. For Tibetans, the Dalai Lama's flight symbolized both the tragedy of losing their homeland and the hope of keeping their struggle alive beyond Tibet's borders. In the decades that followed, China tightened its grip on Tibet. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s devastated Tibetan society as monasteries were destroyed, monks and nuns were forced to renounce their vows, and Tibetan cultural practices were outlawed. The very heart of Tibetan identity, its religion, was systematically targeted. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, thousands of monasteries had been reduced to rubble, and centuries of Tibetan art, scripture, and tradition were lost. Yet despite the destruction, the spirit of resistance did not die. In exile, the Dalai Lama became a global advocate for Tibet's freedom, traveling the world and raising awareness about the plight of his people. His message of non-violence and compassion resonated with audiences everywhere, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. Under his leadership, the Tibetan government in exile kept the dream of an independent Tibet alive, even as China insisted that Tibet was an inseparable part of its territory. Inside Tibet, resistance continued, though often in subtle and symbolic ways. Tibetans held on to their language, practiced Buddhism in secret, and passed down stories of their struggle to younger generations. In the 1980s, protests erupted once again in Lhasa as Tibetans demanded greater freedom. These demonstrations were met with harsh crackdowns, including mass arrests and shootings. The cycle of protest and repression became a defining feature of Tibet's modern history. The 1990s and 2000s saw the emergence of a new form of resistance, self-immolation. Dozens of Tibetans, including monks, nuns, and ordinary citizens, set themselves on fire to protest Chinese rule and to call for the return of the Dalai Lama. These tragic acts drew global attention to the desperation of the Tibetan people, but they also highlighted the lack of progress in their struggle. China, meanwhile, continued to strengthen its control over Tibet through economic development and migration policies. Massive infrastructure projects, including railways and highways, were built to connect Tibet more closely with the rest of China. Han Chinese migrants were encouraged to settle in Tibet, gradually altering the demographic balance. While China touted these projects as signs of progress, Tibetans saw them as tools of assimilation. Throughout this history, the international community has played a complex role. While many countries have expressed sympathy for Tibet and admiration for the Dalai Lama, few have taken concrete steps to challenge China. Geopolitical and economic interests often outweighed human rights concerns. Tibet became a symbol of global conscience, but not a priority in international diplomacy. The Tibetan struggle for independence remains unresolved to this day. For Tibetans, the dream of returning to a free homeland endures, even as the realities of Chinese power make it seem distant. The struggle has evolved from armed resistance to peaceful advocacy, from local uprisings to global campaigns. It is a story of resilience, faith, and the unyielding determination of a people to preserve their identity against overwhelming odds. The roots of Tibet's identity. To understand why Tibet's independence matters so deeply to its people, one must look at the roots of Tibetan identity. Unlike many nations whose struggles are driven by political ideologies or economic interests, Tibet's story is rooted in spirituality and culture. Buddhism, which entered Tibet from India in the 7th century, became the foundation of Tibetan society. Monasteries were not only places of worship, but also centers of learning, art, and governance. The fusion of religion and politics gave rise to the institution of the Dalai Lama, which became central to Tibetan identity. The Dalai Lama was regarded not only as a political leader, but also as the living embodiment of compassion, an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of mercy. For Tibetans, loyalty to the Dalai Lama was not a matter of mere politics, it was a sacred duty. This spiritual political system gave Tibet a distinct character, unlike any other region under Chinese influence. This unique identity is precisely what China sought to dismantle. The Communist Party, grounded in Marxist-Leninist ideology, viewed religion as a form of superstition and a threat to state authority. When the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, it was not only a military conquest, but also the beginning of an ideological campaign to reshape Tibetan society. The struggle that followed was not just about borders and sovereignty, but about the survival of a way of life. The early resistance. The Tibetan resistance after 1950 was remarkable given the overwhelming odds. In eastern Tibet, particularly in Kham and Amdo, local communities formed militias to fight against Chinese forces. These fighters, often mounted on horseback and armed with little more than traditional weapons, launched guerrilla attacks against the PLA. Though poorly equipped, their knowledge of the rugged terrain gave them some advantage. By the mid-1950s, resistance coalesced into a broader movement. The Chushi Gangdruk, a volunteer army of Tibetan resistance fighters, emerged as a major force. With covert support from the CIA during the Cold War, Tibetan fighters carried out daring raids against Chinese positions. They smuggled information, spread underground literature, and kept alive the hope of freedom. However, the might of the Chinese state was relentless. By 1959, the uprising in Lhasa marked both the peak and collapse of the early resistance. The brutal crackdown decimated organized armed resistance inside Tibet, forcing many fighters to flee across the Himalayas. Yet even in exile, these fighters carried their struggle forward, joining the diaspora community that would play a crucial role in the international campaign for Tibet. Life in exile. When the Dalai Lama crossed into India in 1959, he was joined by tens of thousands of Tibetans who became refugees. India, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, granted asylum to the Dalai Lama and his followers. The town of Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh became the center of the Tibetan government in exile. Schools, monasteries, and cultural institutions were established to preserve Tibetan traditions in exile. For the refugee community, exile was both a hardship and an opportunity. On the one hand, Tibetans faced poverty, displacement, and the trauma of losing their homeland. On the other, exile gave them the freedom to organize politically, advocate internationally, and raise awareness about Tibet. The Dalai Lama's leadership in exile was crucial. He encouraged education, modernization, and democratic governance within the Tibetan community. In 1960, the Tibetan Parliament in exile was established, giving Tibetans a voice in their political future. The Tibetan diaspora spread across the world, from India and Nepal to Europe and North America. Wherever they settled, Tibetans carried with them the message of their struggle. Tibetan Buddhism, with its emphasis on compassion and mindfulness, began to attract global followers. Monks traveled abroad, teaching meditation and spreading Tibetan culture. In a paradoxical way, exile gave Tibetans global visibility they might never have had otherwise. China's transformation of Tibet. While the Tibetan exile community built a new life abroad, China worked tirelessly to transform Tibet internally. After crushing resistance, the Chinese state embarked on a campaign of assimilation. The goals were clear: weaken Tibetan identity, dilute loyalty to the Dalai Lama, and integrate Tibet fully into the People's Republic of China. One of the key strategies was demographic change. The Chinese government encouraged Han Chinese migration into Tibet, altering the region's demographics. In cities like Lhasa, Han migrants gained control of businesses, government jobs, and economic opportunities, often leaving Tibetans marginalized. At the same time, Tibet's natural resources were exploited on a massive scale. Rich in minerals, forests, and water, Tibet became a valuable asset for China's industrial ambitions. Dams were constructed on Tibet's rivers, affecting not only Tibet but also neighboring countries that depended on these rivers. Tibet's vast grasslands were mined, deforested, and degraded, disrupting the environment that had sustained nomadic communities for centuries. Religious suppression was perhaps the most painful aspect for Tibetans. Monasteries, once the heart of Tibetan life, were placed under strict state control. Monks and nuns had to undergo political re-education and pledge loyalty to the Communist Party. Portraits of the Dalai Lama were banned, replaced by images of Mao Zedong. The Chinese state sought to redefine Tibetan Buddhism as a cultural artifact rather than a living faith. The Cultural Revolution in Tibet. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, was one of the darkest chapters in Tibetan history. Red Guards, driven by Mao's radical ideology, targeted religion as the enemy of socialism. Monasteries were looted, sacred scriptures burned, and statues of the Buddha smashed. Monks and nuns were publicly humiliated, beaten, and forced to abandon their vows. The scale of destruction was immense. Out of more than 6,000 monasteries that existed in Tibet before 1959, only a handful survived the Cultural Revolution. Centuries of art, literature, and spiritual knowledge were obliterated in a matter of years. For Tibetans, it was not only the loss of physical heritage, but also an assault on the very core of their identity. Yet even in this time of devastation, the Tibetan spirit endured. Families secretly preserved religious texts, monks continued to teach in hidden gatherings, and ordinary Tibetans risked their lives to keep their traditions alive. The resilience displayed during this period laid the foundation for the survival of Tibetan culture despite decades of repression. Tibet in the post-Mao era. With the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the rise of Deng Xiaoping, China began a period of reform and opening up. Tibet too experienced some changes. The new leadership allowed limited religious freedom, and some monasteries were rebuilt. The Dalai Lama was invited to send delegations to Tibet in the 1980s to observe the situation. These visits gave exiled Tibetans a brief glimpse of their homeland and raised hopes of reconciliation. However, hopes for meaningful autonomy were quickly dashed. While China allowed some cultural revival, it maintained strict political control. Tibetans were permitted to practice religion only under the watchful eye of the state. Any sign of loyalty to the Dalai Lama was harshly punished. The Chinese government insisted that Tibet was an inseparable part of China and rejected all calls for independence. In 1987, the Dalai Lama presented his 5-point peace plan in Washington, D.C., calling for genuine autonomy for Tibet within China, rather than full independence. His proposal included demilitarizing Tibet, protecting its environment, and promoting human rights. While the plan gained international attention, China dismissed it outright. Meanwhile, inside Tibet, resentment boiled over. Protests erupted in Lhasa in the late 1980s, with monks leading demonstrations demanding freedom and their turn of the Dalai Lama. The Chinese government responded with martial law and violent crackdowns. The images of Tibetan monks marching peacefully, only to be beaten and arrested, shocked the world. Once again, Tibet became a symbol of resistance against authoritarianism. The rise of global awareness. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Tibet had captured the attention of the global community in ways it never had before. The brutal crackdowns in Lhasa coincided with the global spotlight on human rights abuses in China, especially after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Tibet became part of a larger narrative, the struggle of ordinary people against the might of an authoritarian state. Western media began to cover Tibet more extensively. Images of monks in saffron robes facing down armed soldiers became iconic symbols of courage. The Dalai Lama, exiled yet charismatic, traveled tirelessly, meeting world leaders, addressing parliaments, and speaking at universities. His calm demeanor and insistence on non-violence struck a chord with audiences weary of conflict. In 1989, the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee praised his consistent commitment to non-violence, even in the face of oppression. This recognition not only elevated the Tibetan cause, but also placed it firmly within the global human rights movement. The prize gave Tibetans a new wave of visibility, and for a brief moment, it seemed that Tibet might become a central issue in international diplomacy. At the same time, Tibet's spiritual traditions were winning global admiration. Tibetan Buddhism spread widely across Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia. Monasteries in exile welcomed students from around the world, and the teachings of compassion and mindfulness found eager audiences. Celebrities, intellectuals, and ordinary people embraced the Tibetan cause, turning it into a moral issue rather than just a political one. But visibility did not translate into concrete political change. While many leaders expressed admiration for the Dalai Lama and sympathy for Tibetans, few were willing to risk their economic and diplomatic ties with China. Tibet became a rallying cry for civil society, NGOs, and activists, but in government corridors, realpolitik prevailed. The Chinese state and the Tibet question. For China, Tibet was never simply a borderland. It was a matter of sovereignty, nationalism, and security. The Communist Party viewed any concession on Tibet as a threat to its authority, fearing that it could encourage separatism in other regions like Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, or even Hong Kong. The idea of territorial integrity became a cornerstone of China's domestic and foreign policy. In the 1990s and 2000s, China launched massive campaigns to develop Tibet economically. The rhetoric was clear: development would bring stability, and stability would ensure loyalty. Billions of dollars were invested in infrastructure, including the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, which connected Lhasa to the rest of China. Highways, airports, and power plants were built, transforming the Tibetan plateau. On the surface, these projects brought material benefits. Cities grew, schools and hospitals were built, and consumer goods became available. But beneath this development was a strategy of assimilation. Han Chinese migrants were given incentives to move to Tibet, often taking the best jobs and opportunities. The local population increasingly found itself marginalized in its own land. Education became a tool of assimilation. Tibetan children were taught Mandarin as the primary language, with Tibetan relegated to secondary status. Patriotic education campaigns glorified the Communist Party while denouncing the Dalai Lama as a separatist. For young Tibetans, the classroom became a space where their identity was systematically reshaped. Religious institutions were also tightly controlled. The selection of Tibetan lamas, including the reincarnation of important figures, had to be approved by the Chinese state. The most striking example was the case of the Panchen Lama, the second highest spiritual authority in Tibet. In 1995, the Dalai Lama recognized a 6-year-old boy, Gedhun Choeki Nyima, as the new Panchen Lama. Within days, the child disappeared, taken by Chinese authorities. In his place, China appointed another boy, one loyal to the party. To this day, the real Panchen Lama remains missing, one of the youngest and most famous political prisoners in the world. The wave of self-immolations. As the new millennium unfolded, Tibetans found themselves at a crossroads. Peaceful protests inside Tibet were consistently met with harsh crackdowns. Dialogue between the Dalai Lama's representatives and Chinese officials stalled repeatedly. Frustration boiled over into a tragic new form of protest: self-immolation. Starting in 2009, monks, nuns, and even lay people began setting themselves on fire in public spaces, crying out for freedom and the return of the Dalai Lama. These acts were shocking in their desperation. Each self-immolation was not just a protest, but a statement that life under oppression had become unbearable. Over the next decade, more than 150 Tibetans self-immolated. Many left behind messages declaring their loyalty to the Dalai Lama and their wish for Tibetan independence. The Chinese government responded by criminalizing self-immolation, arresting families of the deceased, and tightening surveillance around monasteries. To the world, these self-immolations were both heart-wrenching and frustrating. They highlighted the depths of Tibetan despair, yet they also underscored the futility of the struggle in the face of Chinese power. Governments issued statements of concern, NGOs raised awareness, but little changed on the ground. Tibet and the Olympic spotlight. In 2008, Tibet once again captured global headlines during the run-up to the Beijing Olympics. The Games were meant to showcase China's rise as a modern, powerful nation. Instead, they became a flashpoint for protests around Tibet and human rights. In March 2008, protests erupted in Lhasa, coinciding with the anniversary of the 1959 uprising. The demonstrations quickly spread to other Tibetan areas, with monks, students, and ordinary citizens taking to the streets. Chinese authorities responded with overwhelming force. Troops poured into the region, and a wave of arrests followed. The crackdown was severe, but the protests had already drawn international attention. Activists around the world disrupted the Olympic torch relay, calling for freedom in Tibet. Slogans of "Free Tibet" appeared across cities in Europe and North America. For a brief moment, Tibet was at the center of global consciousness, reminding the world that its struggle had never ended. The Dalai Lama's middle way. Throughout these decades, the Dalai Lama pursued what he called the middle way approach. Rather than demanding full independence, he proposed genuine autonomy within the framework of the People's Republic of China. His goal was to preserve Tibetan culture, religion, and way of life, while accepting Chinese sovereignty. This approach was pragmatic, reflecting the reality of Chinese power and the lack of international support for Tibetan independence. But it was also controversial. Many Tibetans, especially in the diaspora, felt that the middle way was a compromise too far, a surrender of their dream of independence. Others argued it was the only realistic path forward. China, however, rejected the middle way outright. For the Communist Party, any notion of autonomy beyond its own definitions was seen as a threat. Official dialogue between the Dalai Lama's envoys and Chinese leaders broke down in the 2010s, leaving the movement at an impasse. Tibet in the 21st century. Today, Tibet is one of the most heavily surveilled regions in the world. Cameras monitor streets and monasteries, police checkpoints dot the roads, and online communication is strictly controlled. Travel restrictions limit Tibetans' ability to move freely, while foreign journalists and observers are rarely allowed in. Despite this, Tibetans continue to resist, often in quiet but powerful ways. They preserve their language at home, teach Buddhism in secret, and pass on stories of their history to their children. Festivals, songs, and rituals keep alive the memory of a free Tibet. The diaspora, meanwhile, continues to advocate on the world stage, keeping Tibet's struggle visible even as international attention shifts to other issues. Technology has given Tibetans new tools. Social media, though monitored, allows messages to leak out. Images and videos from inside Tibet occasionally reach the outside world, sparking solidarity campaigns. Young Tibetans in exile use online platforms to spread awareness, organize protests, and connect with global activists. At the same time, Tibet's future remains uncertain. The Dalai Lama, now in his late 90s, is a unifying figure. His eventual passing raises questions about the movement's direction. China has already declared that it will control the recognition of the next Dalai Lama, setting the stage for amateur conflict between Tibetan religious tradition and state authority. The geopolitics of silence. One of the greatest challenges Tibet faces is the silence of the international community. While many governments express concern for human rights in Tibet, few are willing to confront China directly. The reason is simple. China's economic and geopolitical power makes most countries reluctant to jeopardize their relations. India, which hosts the Dalai Lama and the largest Tibetan exile community, has its own complicated relationship with China. Border tensions and economic ties shape its policy, often limiting how far it can go in supporting Tibet. The United States and European nations pass resolutions, hold hearings, and meet Tibetan leaders, but they stop short of recognizing Tibet as anything other than a part of China. This silence is deeply frustrating for Tibetans. They see their struggle as a moral issue, a fight for justice and survival. Yet on the international stage, morality is often overshadowed by pragmatism. Tibet remains caught in the gap between sympathy and action. Tibet's struggle for independence is not just a political conflict, but a fight for survival, culture, and identity. For centuries, Tibet thrived as a distinct civilization shaped by Buddhism and the leadership of the Dalai Lama. The arrival of Chinese forces in the 1950s marked the start of a long period of occupation, suppression, and exile. Monasteries were destroyed, traditions were silenced, and voices of resistance were crushed. Yet despite decades of hardship, Tibetans have preserved their language, faith, and loyalty to their leader. The Dalai Lama's message of peace and non-violence has inspired the world, even as governments hesitate to confront China. Though the future remains uncertain, Tibet's spirit endures. It survives in the resilience of its people, the preservation of its culture, and the unyielding hope that one day freedom will return to the land of snow.